Hi, good day, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It's morning here. I'm greeting you from Johannesburg, South Africa. My name is Donna Andrews. I'm here today to talk to you about ecological debt as part of your economic justice school. And I'd like to share some reflections on ecological debt and specifically my history and experience with the concept. And then I think I'd like to be able to share with you and speak to the analytical potential of ecological debt, and specifically how it can offer us a critique or a way into critiquing the dominant modes of living, and specifically the impact of industrial capitalism and the consequences of its logic on society and conceptions of nature specifically. And then I'd like to kind of speak to how ecological debt offers us an entry point into building a campaign for a socio-ecological and economic just society. So I hope that I can cover that and hopefully some of the other ground in relation to thinking about what are the planetary constraints that we are confronted with. More specifically, can we count loss and should we count it? And if we do that, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way which ensures that we build a society that we want? And then I'd like to talk about the relevance of ecological debt today, which is different from, in some ways, where the concept and term emerged, but how can we expand that relevance and see that as part of a broader space in relation to building movements, building campaigns, etc., and the different spaces that we work in, and ensure that there's synergies all the time. The two other things I'd like to do, I'd like to, because it's my specific area, I'd like to ask us to think about how do we expand the concept of ecological debt. As powerful as it is, can it be expanded? And if so, why? What is the potential of that, as well as the limitations of that? So that's kind of the ground and the space that I'd like to cover in our time today. And hopefully when we see each other on the 1st of October, I think it is, you have the opportunity to engage and ask more questions. I hope I'm not going too fast. I hope that you are comfortable, that you have your water and your coffee with you, and you have the pause button or mute button at any point during this conversation. So, like I said, I was reflecting on how I was introduced to this concept of ecological debt. And I thought about, why did I want to enter this conversation in relation to my personal reflection? Well, the one reason is that the materials that you have, I've provided you a few. Some of them are academic, are found in academic journals. One or two of them are book chapters. And then there's some popular material in relation to it. I didn't do a good enough job to find the Portuguese and Spanish work in relation to this. But what struck me again, almost now 20 years, it's 20 years in fact, from my first introduction, was that reading the material and doing a literature review in relation to ecological debt somehow felt fundamentally different and strange and peculiar to me, which is why I decided to share a bit rather about my reflection. So in 1999, 20 years ago, how I was introduced to the concept of ecological debt. And it was through the Jubilee South conference in Johannesburg. At the time I was working for Jubilee South, and it was a conference that brought many people together in Johannesburg. I was already engaged around work in relation to debt, specifically around apartheid debt. We also refer to it as odious debt and specifically as illegitimate debt. And effectively, I was working in this area where we were saying to the South African government that South Africans in the new dispensation, in the new South Africa, in the post-apartheid period, shouldn't be paying for apartheid debt. This debt was incurred by the apartheid regime, an illegitimate regime, and it was incurred so as to both for military expenditure, but specifically for lifestyles and consumption, etc., of white South Africans. So it excluded, it was incurred in a way to be able to repress and oppress the vast majority of South Africans. And by insisting that we repay this debt, in fact, was a triple burden. How is it even possible that we should be repaying debt that was incurred, foreign debt that was incurred by the apartheid regime? And in paying this debt, we effectively would be undermining redress and transformation. And we'd be undermining redress and transformation because we literally using and redirecting necessary resources from our coffers to pay foreign debt. And this was unjust. But of course, you can see that this is connected to the conversation that you had earlier in the week, which really was part of this growing third world debt cancellation movement and campaign around the world. And so the social and economic and political and moral impact was clear for me in relation to thinking about odious debt and within this broader space of third world debt. So it completely echoed to me. I participated in various sessions of this Jubilee South conference, and I then went to a session on ecological debt. I went to the session by mistake, and I went to it by mistake because there were some translation issues, so I had to go. But I was skeptical about this concept because I was doing work around odious debt and etc., and I wanted to go there. And I was skeptical as well because in 1997 I participated in a process where people were speaking about environmental issues, but I couldn't relate to it at the time. It seemed somewhat foreign to me. They spoke about how to protect forests and oceans, and I was talking about how to protect the dignity and lives of Black women. So there was a discord for me originally when I had first heard about this idea and this concept, etc. Or maybe I should say that when I listened to it and I listened to who was talking about it, it felt foreign to me and strange to me. But I went to the session on ecological debt that Jubilee South had organized. And in the meeting, in this workshop, in this session, there was something else that had happened. I heard something that I had never heard before, and I was literally transformed. I heard Ecuadorians speak about how nature and the ecological destruction, about nature and ecological destruction. And as they spoke, it resonated. They spoke about how colonialism and plunder and greed destroyed the forest, and with destroying the forest and the biodiversity, it destroyed languages and people and relationships and ways of being with each other. They really spoke to me, and as they spoke, I understood that effectively what they were talking about, this ecological debt, was how this particular destruction over time, etc., was destroying an entire web of relationships, and how this was shattered and destroyed by the North, and by calling this third world debt, this destruction, and reclaiming this term of third world debt, of ecological debt, was reorientating this entire notion, and saying that the debt that we have to repay from the South to the North in terms of foreign debt, this third world debt, was in fact illegitimate, and that in fact the South was the ecological creditors. This was a transformative moment for me, and I hope for you too. The concept of ecological debt might have a different meaning and resonate differently with you, because for the first time in this room, in this session in 1999, I completely understood the ecological world starting from a different place. It wasn't just an environment out there. And coming from South Africa, you must understand that the notion of the environment and green and the forest, etc., was something completely removed and distant and unrelated to my reality at the time. And so it was through this process that I understood that the way of living by the North, the way in which they consumed and the way they wasted, was at the expense of the people of the South. And so by rethinking and reclaiming this idea of saying, hey, we don't owe, we don't pay, that in fact that we are the ecological creditors, and third world debt is completely illegitimate. It transformed another level of my thinking around illegitimate and odious debt. Over the years, I began to listen to numerous narratives that shared various elements of what the Ecuadorians had shared that day, in Africa and in Southern Africa in particular. In South Africa, a lot of that discussion has revolved around the elimination of indigenous seed heritage. It's looked at the questions of the impact of pollution and poisonous gases in Durban and refinery fumes and the impact of that, for instance, in KwaZulu-Natal. It's looked and spoken about the impact and the history of mining, specifically diamond and gold mining, and the plunder and the plunder and the impact of extractivism. So with time, this concept of ecological debt not only became just an idea and a concept, but it really ignited for me a way of thinking about the world differently, and how ecological use, ecological space in the world, in the planet, is unequal, and how certain people benefit and accrue benefits, and that accrual of those benefits are unequally distributed. And when we look at the region and we look at South Africa specifically, but certainly Southern Africa, we can see that the terms of trade, of natural resource extraction and production of products is completely unequal in our society. What's important really more than anything else for me over this time was that we export large amounts of our wealth to the North, large amounts of our natural resources, large amounts of our knowledge, large amounts of our skill, our intellectual heritage, our knowledge bases, our learning, our languages, etc., through all these natural resources. And in doing this, effectively, the North not only accrue this, but we don't have any commensurate value to the amount of wealth that we send to the North, through not only what the Ecuadorians then explained in relation to colonialism and the process of colonialism, which was long and expansive, etc., but this process of capitalism, this particular period of capitalism and industrialization, etc. And as a result of that particular period, which is a more latent period, but how we are able to see that knowledge and resources are destroyed and stolen, not only over time, but certainly more recently as well. And I think that what this brings to mind is how deep the extent of this environmental injustice is. So in this case, we're thinking about the amount of gold, and I just use South Africa as an example, the amount of gold and diamonds and deforestation and sort of marine life, etc., that is extracted, and that extraction and those natural resources are then commodified, and through that commodification we export them, right? But in that process, more importantly, what we don't see also and often don't speak about is how, in the case of South Africa, what we also have is not the deep environmental injustice that occurs, but the apartheid legacy of this inequality, where one part of the society live in a particular way, and the vast majority live in impoverished conditions and effectively environmental squalor. So here we're talking about not just the North, the North owing the South, the countries of the South, but here we're talking also about another element, which is how there is the North in the South. There are those who accrue much at the expense of many others, for instance, in the case of South Africa. So I think that that's another important element, because in South Africa, the North conceptually is very much here. We can see that through inequality. We can see that through the extent of the degradation and the difference of lifestyle and consumption and waste between the haves and the have-nots. So I think that I share that reflection in part because when we think about ecological debt, the concept and the definitions, as you look at the slides, etc., you'll be able to see that there's a history that is spoken about there. There's a history which speaks about how in the late 80s and certainly in the early 90s, that the entire concept of ecological debt was linked to the Rio Earth Summit and a growing awareness of environmental issues, and that was the beginning, the beginning of discussions around environmental degradation and about a global awareness around climate change, etc. And there's a history there, but in that history is how specific experiences in particular places and situated knowledge gets articulated into this concept of ecological debt, which is, I guess, why I'm sharing specifically about South Africa and my experience of that. It's to locate that experience for myself, to be able to situate my knowledge in that process and in the production of that process. Because I think that ecological debt, as important as it is, and as you'll see, should and can have a universalizing sense of and definition, etc. It also only has its weight and can have its weight when it's located and connected to a particular place and time and period, which I think is really important. And as I indicated, the Latin American and peasant movements, and specifically when I spoke at the start, was about Ecuador and how that brought a particular dimension, that experience. And later you'll see in the material about Chile specifically and how concerns there were being articulated. But, you know, I've worked in the region for a very long time, and as a result of working in the region, it becomes apparent to me that this discussion of ecological debt is very much here, and that African women organizations have linked the question of land and sea to the ecological question. More recently, they've linked it to the question of extractivism specifically, but the Asian women movements linked it to forests and seed and fishing. And these women's movements were and are primarily defenders and protectors and the regenerators of nature, and effectively carry the burden of the plunder. They carry the burden of the plunder at two levels, like in the case of South Africa, they carry the burden of the plunder of nature, both historically, with the taking away of land and seed and knowledge and heritage and community, but they also carry the burden by having to protect, having to nurture, having to regenerate alongside themselves, but the protectors of our natural environment. I think that the discussions in the materials indicate that there's an organic process in which this idea of ecological debt emerges, and it arises very much through the sort of social movements and campaigns, etc., as a response to place pressure on the governments of the South to say, look, we shouldn't be repaying debt. You shouldn't, as the governments of the South, shouldn't be repaying debt. And in the case of South Africa, it was we shouldn't be, the new South Africa, we shouldn't be repaying odious debts or foreign debts at all, because these debts are odious and these debts are stranglehold on our ability to have redress and and to be able to transform our society in the way that we envisage. So in effect, it was a stranglehold on how to reimagine a society in a new way. And so that's a really important element in relation to that. I think one of the key elements as well is that ecological debt was then understood as a way to speak against international financial institutions and third world debt, and most importantly, it was a counter-hegemonic concept and a response to the implications of massive structural adjustment programs and the conditionalities that were being imposed around the repayments of the debt. So I think that that's a really important to bear in mind, sort of that historical legacy. But also it meant that ecological debt was positioned and placed in a particular way to be talking about alternatives. So in other words, by saying that we have an ecological debt owed to us, we effectively wanting to be able to say, we in fact must be repaid. It's not that we have to, in the South, the countries of the South and the people of the South have to repay the North. In fact, it's the other way around. And so by speaking about that in that way, it repositioned the articulation of power, it re-articulated the idea of destruction, and repositioned the idea of reparation and redress onto the global agenda. And of course, this tied into later the anti-WTO movements and trade-related movements, which was tied to debt cancellation and anti-privatization, and then became bigger and more prominent through the World Social Forum movement. So I think that that's one other really important element to consider and to have in mind. There's then an ebb and a flow to ecological debt, and it's taken up, of course, by NGOs, it's taken up by academics, etc. And then there's a bit of a disconnect and a lull, I think, between how that's taken up within the academy and by researchers and social movements. And in part, that's because there's a lull within the world in relation to social movements and responses to post Cancun. And so that particular dynamism then gets picked up again in sort of 2009, 2010, in a more official and formal way through the rise of the climate justice work, and specifically the Bolivians using the climate issue and climate debt as a means of negotiations. So that's a really important point to note again. So there's a re-emergence, there's a re-energy, and that happens around COP17 through to COP15, COP17, and later, of course, COP27. But there's a discussion that connects one element or two elements to ecological debt, and that's the question of climate debt and the polluter pay principle. And this is an uptide, this is but in a formal process, and begins to reconsolidate, reintegrate climate processes with the climate movement, social movements and campaigns, NGOs, research institutions, etc. And so it's important to then be able to see that the narrative isn't only one, but there are multiple narratives. And as we try and write these stories, in doing that, we sometimes we able to show the history and the diversity of this, but also we able to not do so, and in doing that, just to bear in mind that it isn't a linear process, that there are multiple stories, and it originates from multiple places. So I think that's really important, and that over time, of course, the concept of ecological debt in retelling and rethinking and reclaiming, it's important because there's a contested terrain in relation to the question of ecological debt, and specifically because the climate question re-articulates in a particular way, and the claim to have climate debt, then people and institutions and researchers are trying to think about repositioning what that means, right? And whether or not countries in the North are willing to or prepared to say that, yes, they owe this ecological debt and recognize the ecological debt, or that there's a climate debt and what that would mean. So that's really important and brings us to this discussion in relation to, in real terms, what does recognition then mean? What would the recognition of ecological debt be? How would we be able to talk about recognition? Is it just an apology? Is it more than an apology? Is it more than just a political tool? Is it an economic and a social tool? And if it's an economic tool, then what does that mean? And that's a really important question. Because when we start to talk about ecological debt in economic terms, we're talking about how to quantify this plunder historically and over time, but we're also talking about how to quantify ecological debt in a particular place, particular sectors, and a particular sets of periods, right? So can we start to account for the resources that have been plundered and have been extracted? And are we able to account, in other words, can we put a monetary value to the ecological impact? Now, earlier I spoke about, overfishing. We can think about deforestation, but are we able to calculate this? And and what means are we able to calculate, for instance, overfishing and deforestation? And in that counting process, what are we unable to account? And I think that is a really important element when we're thinking about that. So are we able to, when we think about the biological debt, the carbon debt, the ecological footprint, are we able to quantify, and in that quantification, what are the challenges in relation to that? Today we know, compared to when we started this conversation around ecological debt, that we count the carbon emissions per person all the time. We count carbon emissions. We're able to account for trade flows and biodiversity loss. That's a large component of what we're able to do already. And so the question of being able to put numbers to the ecological debt is no longer problematic for us. We are able to do that. The question is just to always be reminded that the number that we place on ecological debt, the actual accounting number, the amount that we give to it, the amount of trillions in concrete damages over several decades, is about being able to accrue liabilities, right, to particular firms, multinationals, etc., and their states, to be able to ensure that there's some sort of ecological restoration that can take place, and that each country in the North is able to calculate their environmental debt. So that's important, and it can be done. And so in being able to say what constitutes this debt, we're able to say very clearly that the things that require redress, it's not just sufficient to talk about. We recognize that there's been the plunder of during the colonial period. We recognize that there's been damages to land and indigenous seeds and biodiversity, and that we recognize that there's this appropriation of indigenous knowledge and plant life, and this extreme damages to biodiversity through extraction, and most importantly, how this jeopardizes the survival and livelihoods of people in the South. So we're able to quantify what constitutes these debts. Sort of the degradation of oceans and marine life. We're able to talk about the depletion of fishing stocks. We're able to talk about the contamination of air, emissions of greenhouse gases, the damage to the ozone layer through and as a result of excessive industrial processes. We can definitely count the dumping of waste we can see that just by looking at consumption and waste patterns, we're able to talk about how the dumping of waste creates extreme contamination and high emissions, right? And the impact of pesticide. There's extensive work done in relation to this. We can go back to the work of Rachel Carson, etc. When we just look at a map of the ecological footprint, etc., we can see the ecological deficits and the ecological reserves. And it's quite clear. We just have to look at an image, and when we look at the planet, we can see, certainly of Earth, we can see wherever there are red spots, that's the ecological deficit. That's where there is the highest carbon emissions that is happening, and the ecological reserves are where where there are deep green colors, right? And those colors are really starting to disappear. So when we look even on a map, we'll see that generally it's the Congo and that river basin there, and Brazil, and those are where these massive forests are, effectively the lungs of the earth. So we're able to see that ecological impact there, and we're able to count that level of impact. More importantly, we are able to see in Southern Africa, we can see over time, we can see how the biodiversity capacity of land has depreciated dramatically. And here we only have data that we're looking at from 1996, but you know, the slide that I showed you, you can begin to see already the fishing grounds depreciate dramatically, the croplands and the forest and grazing land diminishes over time. What we also see simultaneously is that you see a spike in the ecological footprint in terms of Southern Africa, where that's happened. It's still, comparatively speaking to the north, it's marginal and small, but even there we have to ask, why is that the case and what's happening there? South Africa, of course, in Southern Africa, I mentioned this already, is red. The carbon emissions are extreme in relation to here. So you know, to come back to again this definition and this thinking about ecological debt, it's important to just bear in mind that the one definition which I think is really useful, which is the Ecuadorian one, which is that the ecological debt is debt that is accumulated by the northern industrial countries towards the third world countries on account of resource plundering, environmental damages, and the free occupation of environmental space to deposit waste such as greenhouse gases, etc. So the definitions are there, and we're definitely able to account for it. More recently, from 2014, 2015, we again referring to the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over a long period of time, and that there can be no denial of ecological debt. We know this, right, through the pollution of land and rivers, etc. And over this recent period, we're talking about new forms of land grabs, new forms of extractivism, etc. And so I think that what we also put in on the agenda is being able to talk about how this third world foreign debt has been controlling the possibilities of alternatives and development of the South, and that we must be able to say that we are the ecological creditors and that we are owed an ecological debt. And not only should we be able to say that, we should be able to say that there is, by asking and speaking about this, we're also saying that the consumption of non-renewable energy needs to be thought of, and we need to be able to see how do we ensure that there's a more equitable distribution of that, and not just see that, but in fact say that it's unequal, and more importantly, by saying that it's unequal, begin to ask new questions. I think that the People's Charter for Africa in 2013 said very clearly, as we know that the earth is sacred to us, and no person or legal entity has the right to pollute or degrade the soil, waters, and atmosphere that sustains all life. That those who harm the earth shall be held accountable and should be held accountable. And more importantly, they should be held accountable because they are exploiting planet Earth so as to profiteer in a way which is inequitable, but also not just only that it's done in a way which is unfair and unequal, but it's also done at the expense of our collective survival over time. So I think I suspect I'm over my time already. But I think that the idea of using ecological debt is also to be able to, for us to be able to reverse, and you'll read this in one of the articles, reverse the arrows of debt or arrears. And this is important because it ensures that not only the historical injustices and restitution can take place, but we can draw on theories of ecological economics to be able to account for this, as I mentioned earlier, environmental justice, etc. And we can account for the biosphere. I think the question for us must be over and over as we do this counting about being mindful of the commodification of nature, and that we don't reinforce this idea that by counting our losses and by counting nature and by putting a monetary amount in it, that we're necessarily saying that we think that nature, the only value of nature is as a natural resource to dominate over. We're not in fact saying all of that at all. We're actually saying we have to be mindful of that. And in fact, that plunder, and by doing that, is put us in this particular crisis and position that we're in. So I think that the ecological debt, we must ensure that we are interlinking this in a particular way, and ensure that as stated, that ecological debt must acknowledge the interconnections between society, nature, and the economy. And these three things are usually held in separation. And by holding the economy and society and nature separate, we're able to exploit nature. And in fact, that they are not separate, that they are interconnected, and that they are important to our well-being, our regeneration in society. And by reconnecting them, we're able to think of a new way of being in the world and in the society that we're in, which is important, because it's only through reconnecting that we understand that we're able to live better with each other, but with nature, and provide the elements for a just world. So the dimensions for ecological debt is that we ensure that there's a moral, political, economic, and ecological understanding in relation to that. And at the moment, a lot of the vast conversation is about the economic amount of this, the debt accrued. But we have to be able to say that we have to enhance the moral aspect of this conversation as well, and reignite the political agenda in relation to calling for ecological debt. So when we think about the ecological debt, we must ask ourselves, how can we extend this beyond the notion of the Anthropocene, and how we can include the question of embodied debt, and specifically how the question of race and gender and nature can become more prominent in the discussion. At the moment, when we think about and talk about ecological debt, we speak a lot about inequality, we speak to power, and of course, because of environmental justice, we speak to the question of race. But the question of gender, the question of nature itself as an agent, social reproduction, regeneration, and the question of body need to be more centered into this discussion of ecological debt. So the last just 3 points I want to make is that ecological debt for us is definitely a way to be able to right the wrongs of the past, certainly by drawing our attention to the work that has happened and the plunder and destruction. But it's really a powerful concept because we can use this to have our political campaigns and advocacy and build build our movements to be able to understand that the question of ecological justice must be in the epicenter. And as we talk about ecological justice, we are effectively talking about ourselves, and that our knowledge, our understanding and our location and our culture and our heritage and our languages have to be recentered as well. And in centering socio-economic and ecological questions, we're talking essentially about redress. And this is really important in this process. And so ecological tech offers us a tool, a key to social ecological transformation, and is able to make apparent the gross ecological destructions over time, and most importantly, be able to show that the South, it's the South and the peoples of the South and the countries of the South that is effectively subsidized the North. And we've subsidized their livelihood, we've subsidized the way that they live, we subsidize their consumption, etc., at our expense, at the expense of the peoples and the environments of the South. And by using ecological debt, we're able to start to reignite and to rethink the ideas of alternatives in relation to how do we live in a way which which ensures that there's energy, democracy, earth justice, and a logic of sufficiency in the way that we engage in the world. Lastly, I think that what ecological debt requires from us and is an important part of the agenda in this new wave is to ensure that we place value on social reproduction and regeneration. Because ultimately what we can see by the impact of ecological destruction and plunder is that women in the South have been the bearers of this destruction, and they are the ones primarily that regenerate and produce our society and ourselves, and like nature are the regenerators. And this burden is carried predominantly by women's social reproductive work and the exploitation which happens on the laboring bodies of the South. I think that I'm going to end now, and I'm going to end by saying that it's really important that when we think about ecological debt, that yes, we're thinking about the economic accrual, and it's not, it can never, in costing, we can never cost the full extent of the loss and degradation over time and over space. But by doing the costing, by speaking about the numbers, we're starting to acknowledge that there's a vast amount of resources that has been taken away from the South. And in talking about that, we're saying two things. One, that any debt that the South presumably owes the North should be cancelled and should be scrapped. We don't owe that. That's the one thing. The second thing is that in fact the North owes us, right? They owe us a debt, and that debt, when we think about what that debt is and when we demand that debt, we have to be talking about how to ensure that we value the regeneration of nature, and that we start to think about what does that mean in relation to social reproduction, and that the politics of ecological debt is not at all about commodifying nature, but instead about reinserting values which are against exploitation and alienation and oppression of peoples of the South and nature. And I think that that's the essential takeaway for me about our discussion. Thank you very much for your time. I've spoken more than I should have. I hope that we're going to be able to have a rich and deeper discussion when we see each other on the 1st, and that the materials are useful for you, and we can engage with each other and start to use ecological debt as a means to re-leverage, re-energize, and campaign around the extractivism in Southern Africa in particular, and in the world at large. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.